ladies and gentlemen. I am your host, Webster Mrimbika, and with me here today to discuss the colonial history of museums in Zimbabwe and what is being done to decolonize these spaces is Dr. Njabulo Chipangura, a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Urbanism and Built Environment Studies at the University of Witwatersrand. He was previously a curator of archaeology at the Mutare Museum in eastern Zimbabwe for 10 years. Welcome to the podcast, Doctor.
Thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here to share with you my thoughts on museum practices in Zimbabwe and essentially what it means to attempt to decolonize the museum. I think perhaps for the benefit of our audience, decoloniality has been a very, very important concept in terms of trying to reconfigure what it means to produce knowledge within an African context, right? Away from Western epistemologies. So my work essentially looks at how museums as space of cultural knowledge production, as spaces of memory, can also be used to transmit and to transform the colonial space, which was responsible for the coming and for the promulgation of the concept of a museum in Africa. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And this work is derived from my forthcoming book, which is going to be published on the 12th of April by Routledge. It's called Museum as Agents of Social Change, Decolonization at Mutare Museum. So I'll essentially speak to much of the stuff that is in the book and what we did at Mutare Museum over the past 10 years when I was working there to try and attempt to decolonize the museum space and the museum practice itself.
Hey, Doc. So let us dig into what we are going to be expecting from this latest publication of yours.
Yeah. So, well, from the introduction, you rightly said I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Center for Urbanism and Built Environment Studies at WITS. And I've been a visiting research fellow at UCL, University College London, at their Qatar campus in Doha. So I've been visiting there as a researcher in museums and heritage studies as part of that fellowship, which ultimately resulted in the production of this book that I'm going to talk about this morning. And I worked for National Museums and Monuments of Zimbabwe as a curator of archaeology for 10 good years. And I was based at Mutare Museum from 2009 up until I left late last year in 2020. So my working experience is derived from my interaction with museum communities and the kind of works that we used to do at Mutare Museum, which I'm categorizing as decolonial practices, right? And I think for the benefit of the audience, again, if you look at the list of museums in Zimbabwe or in Africa as a whole, museums were formed as a result of colonization, right? They were colonial creations.
Yeah.
Right? And what do I mean by this? Museums were formed as part of the imperial project, right? Imperial project in the sense that when they were established, let's say, for example, Mutare Museum was established in 1964. That's deep into the colonial period of Zimbabwe, right? And what essentially they were trying to do then was to categorize, right, ethnic cultures, right, cultures of the other. So anthropology, archaeology, and ethnography were used as disciplines to categorize the other, to study and examine indigenous cultures. So most objects that you find in museums in Zimbabwe and Africa as a whole, especially ethnographic objects, they were appropriated from source communities, right? Taken forcefully because this was a period of colonization. Objects were also colonized and placed in a museum. So a museum became a space of displaying, right, presenting exotic cultures, right, cultures that were indigenous to the colonialists, interested in just collecting and amassing and just enjoying, right, the aesthetic beauty of Shona drums, right, the aesthetic beauty of Shona pottery, for example, the aesthetic beauty of Shona baskets, the aesthetic beauty of Shona sculptures, right? But what they didn't do by then, they didn't look at the social biographies of the objects. Because these objects, when they were made within source communities, they're not just made for art's sake or for aestheticism, right? They were made for a particular function. That's the biography of the object. So within their daily use, these objects survived for a long time before they were imprisoned in the museum. Why? Because the museum came in with this kind of scientific trope of saying we're going to collect, preserve, present objects, right, through documentation, whatever you call it. That's a westernized kind of paradigm. But before that, communities used to preserve and protect their own objects using indigenous epistemologies, right? So for me, the question here is, how can we reconnect objects that we find in museums in Zimbabwe, right, with their contemporary? Yes.
Maybe for the benefit of the audience, can you define for us epistemology? What do we mean by epistemology in your own understanding?
Speaking about theories of knowledge, right? So, as I said from the beginning, when the museums were formed, the idea really was knowledge production. They wanted to understand and to get to know indigenous cultures, right? What kind of ethnic groups do we have amongst the Shona, right? And how can we study them, right? Okay. So when you're studying something, you're studying to produce knowledge. So epistemology for me is a theory of knowledge. So how do we think about a museum as a space where knowledge is produced, and what form of knowledges were produced by that time? You have your archaeological knowledge, right? Archaeology. You have your ethnographic knowledge. You've got your anthropological knowledge. You've got your geological knowledge. All these forms of knowledges, right? They are form part of what we're calling epistemes, right? Epistemes, right? And then within these epistemes, we've got what we call ontologies, right? The structure of knowledge. So for me, we need to understand the kind of ontologies that were at the center of the making of the object by local communities. You understand? So what were the ontologies? What were they using these objects for, right? Can we break down the objects into different kinds of uses before they were translocated and dislocated into a museum space, which for me was just an imprisonment of an object in a diorama, in a glass case, where you're not supposed to even touch the object, right? In a museum right now, I think if you go to a museum right now, you can't touch an object on an exhibition, or you can't. It's not allowed. Why? It's a function of conservation and preservation. We argue that you can't touch an object because it's being conserved. What is that? But when you took the object within the source community, that object was being used in day-to-day rituals, right? So that ontology, that structure of the object is what we need to sort of like reinvent within this decolonial moment. The objects had a social biography, a social history. Most of them they were used in contemporary or in traditional ritual practices, right? Those drums that you see in a museum in a glass case, what were they used for, right? They were built for a purpose, right? Traditional rituals, traditional dances, they were used as they were preserved. So for us, decoloniality from a local perspective, right, or from a local ontology point of view, is a process where we don't separate use and conservation. Right? I think if you go back to, I'll give you a good example again of how decolonization has been used in other fields like heritage. Look at Great Zimbabwe, right? Great Zimbabwe is a monument that has been there since time immemorial, right? Like, they're indigenous people who lived around Great Zimbabwe, the Mugabe, the Nemanwa. They know the correct conservation practices, right? They know how to restore those walls without any scientific knowledge, right? That knowledge has been passed from generation to generation, right? So in that sense, right, we need to acknowledge that these sites have been there even before the coming of colonization, right? So how were they protected? How were they preserved? Similarly, museum objects that were taken away from source communities, they've been surviving, right? They're their own kind of indigenous curatorship methods, right? They used to curate these objects, but how, right? Which is different from how the Western frameworks, how Western epistemologists view a museum. A museum, right, by just definition, is a place that collects, right, keeps, presents, documents objects for the purpose of what? Educational reasons, whatever it is, or scientific reasons, right? That's a museum for you. Documentation.
Yeah.
So you start off by collecting, right? You collect. Once you collect, you document or you accession. Once you document, you present, right? Within this presentation method, you have to conserve for eternity or whatever it is. You have to conserve by not allowing your visitors to touch the objects. So for me, the decolonial framework in a Zimbabwean context is a way of us trying to rethink what it means, right, to have source communities that were disenfranchised by colonization, right, having an active voice in the museum space. Now the objects are in the museum, so let's not segregate the community, because each and every object that you find in a museum has a social history, has a biography. So how do we get these narratives?
So they're more like intertwined, the object and the people. They're intertwined. They're
Exactly.
intertwined.
So without the narrative, without the intangible use or the intangible value of the object, there's nothing that we are doing, because you can't separate the physical, the tangible aspect, the fabric of the object from its use. So the use in most cases is an intangible value. So how do we make sure that, or how do we attempt to get silent voices? How do we make sure that these objects can also speak for themselves, right? And how? Let's get the people who made the objects tell us what these objects were used for. So the museum, in a Western methodology or Western concept, is just something that is concerned with preservation, conservation, documentation, and studying, right? Educational values of the object. But what is the use? What was the use of the object before it was brought into the museum space? So I want you to understand this, or I want our audience to understand this. Decoloniality right now is a discourse, right? Not so much concerned about political power and the decoloniality of the 1960s, where liberation movements were trying to get political power, to get territories away from their colonial masters and decolonize the space as it is, right? So decoloniality as a concept right now is more or less like concerned more with knowledge production, right? So subjects, disciplines like archaeology, anthropology, geography, ethnography, they also had a colonial kind of knowledge production mindset, right? Archaeology, for example, is a scientific discipline, right? I mean, you have to go out there and document
Yes.
material culture, excavate, dig, study through chronologies, typologies, you name it, right? Material culture. And that's a science, right? A science of the past, right? You're studying the past using scientific methodologies. But how can we try to decolonize this science and make sure that the indigenous communities, right, have a voice or a say in the ways in which we interpreted material culture? Because I think spirituality, rituals, right, and any other intangible associations with objects have for long been ignored by scientific tropes that come with disciplines like archaeology, anthropology, and ethnography, right? It's about just documenting
Exactly.
and preserving and presenting and writing scientific papers based on material culture analysis. Do you find people or archaeologists trying to get to the bottom of the story and say, okay, within the communities, what form of knowledge structures can we get, and how can they interpret these objects in the absence of scientific values? So that's where decolonization also comes into play. We need to acknowledge that indigenous communities can have equally valid stories that can be told about objects we have in museums, and we can incorporate them using different methodologies. So coming back to the book, right? I've been just going around. Coming back to the book.
Yes.
So the book essentially looks at collaborative projects at Mutare Museum as a decolonial methodology. So we argue that with my co-author, Professor Jesmo Mataga, who's at Soplaka University, is a professor of heritage and archaeology, we argue that collaborations can be thought of as a key strategy of decolonizing the museum practice. So once you collaborate with communities, you are starting a very, very good and big conversation on how and what it means to decolonize the museum space empirically, right? Empirical, which means practically. How do you practice? Because people talk about decoloniality as an epistemology, as a theory, right? But practically, do we know how to do it? Do we know? I think yes, no. But for us, we said, okay, how can we write a narrative around decolonizing the museum using empirical examples of a decolonial practice, right? So, as a starting point, we argue that collaborations, right? Not consultations. I want us to understand this because in the past, people used to think that when you consult a source community, right, you are giving them voice and power. No, consultations are always, and in most cases, there's always the operation of power, and the power usually comes from the one who's designing the project, right? We can go and consult somebody because already we've got an agenda. It's unlike collaborating. Collaborating diffuses knowledge production and makes sure that this knowledge production is equally shared amongst the participants, right? So the research questions are supposed to be informed by the community. They have to tell you that we want this exhibition to be like this, and you have to listen. That's collaborating. Vis-a-vis consulting. Consulting, you sit in a boardroom at Mtare Museum and say, okay, want to do this exhibition, so let's go to Marange and tell them about the exhibition. That's more like consulting. Whereas collaborating, you sit down with the community together and say, okay, let's do this exhibition together. What do you think? What ideas do you have that we can also present and project in this particular exhibition? So from that level, collaborations can be thought of as a very popular methodology that can be used to decolonize the museum space and the museum practice. So the book goes into depth into different kinds of collaborative activities that I was involved in during my tenure at Mutare Museum, right? What kind of practices did we do at Mutare Museum that can be thought of as decolonial collaborative practices?
When we talk about collaborating, we are trying to establish a unanimous approach where we have voices of the people and voices of those that are doing the project.
Exactly. So we have an equal share of power, right? Because remember when I historicized the studying of a museum practice, we said in the past the museum was just formed as a colonial enterprise concerned primarily with research, studying of objects, collections, and scientific values, right? But now we're thinking about how we can bring the voice of the voiceless into the museum space through collaborative projects or through collaborative activities. Communities can have a voice in museum documentation, in museum exhibitions, in museum practices, you name them. They can have a voice. They can equally participate as equal partners, right? When you collaborate with them. So once you strike this collaborative code, then for us, it means you are empirically, practically decolonizing the museum by involving or collaborating with the communities directly in different kinds of museum activities, exhibitions, right? Public programming activities, archaeological excavations. You can actually involve communities in archaeological excavations, right? As a way of decolonizing the archaeological practice. They can go into the trench with you. They can excavate with you as an archaeologist. They can help you to identify material culture and they can help you to interpret it. They'll tell you what they know about this object, which perhaps is not scientific, but that's what they know as a form of indigenous knowledge, right? So decoloniality doesn't dismiss how knowledge is produced. Decolonization as a concept allows for what you call multivocality, right? Or dialogue or multi-conversation, right? It allows for different kinds of interpretations to different forms of knowledge, right? We only don't have knowledge that is based on, let's say, for example, the typological analysis of pottery. You know, you speak about the neck. right? The rim, the body, the base, and so forth. That's archaeology, right? That's scientific. But for the community, they'll tell you differently that this is Tambakodzi, this is Hajgana, right? It was used for this and this and this and this. Without even talking about this typological analysis of pottery, right? So that in itself is an ethnographic narrative which is to be involved or incorporated into the narratives of archaeology as a discipline. So when you do this, you're now trying to decolonize what archaeology used to be, right? It used to be a science of the past, but now it's more or less like a democratic field where communities are allowed to interpret objects from excavations or even objects that are found in a museum on an equal basis with curators or with experts. So moving on to coming back to the book. So the book has, I think, about 5 chapters that speaks to the decolonial project at the Mtare Museum. We start off by historicizing the history of museums in Zimbabwe, but broadly, we do look at museums in Africa as a whole, how they are formed as a result of colonial machinations, right? As a result of the colonial project, right? So, from the inception, the museum can be thought of as a key, right? Key strategic point that was used to colonize locals. The museum, the university, the church, right? You name those institutions. So those places were used to colonize not only the body, but also the mind, right? The mind was also colonized through different kinds of museum practices, right? Objects are taken away from you, they are placed in a museum, they are given new meaning and new context by the colonialists, right? So we speak about this history of colonization and how the museum is a colonial project because it colonizes both the body, right, the person, and the mind, right? I think Walter Minolo is a very popular decolonial scholar from South Pacific. He speaks about the museum, right, and how we can begin to think about undoing colonial legacies, right, in museums and decolonizing the museum space through what we call aesthetic disobedience, right? Because museums were, when they were formed, they were only concerned about aestheticism, right? What is beautiful about this object and how can this object be presented and conserved in the museum without thinking about the function and the use of the object before it went into the museum. So the histories of museums in Africa, they all, apart from South Africa based, but still, they all sort of like fall within the same kind of rubric where we're saying museums in Zimbabwe, Zambia, Botswana, Malawi, Mozambique, Nigeria, Sudan, Senegal, they all came as a result of the colonization process. So now, after independence, right, most of these museums, especially Zimbabwe, they struggled, right, to reconfigure or to change their exhibition so that they can speak to contemporary social needs, right? Or they can speak to the indigenous voices, which were shuttered off by the colonial process. So they continue to reproduce coloniality in different forms, right? The same exhibitions that you see in China Museum right now are the ones that were done in 1964. Nothing has ever changed, right? Which means somehow we're still celebrating colonization within these museum spaces. Do you understand? So the 5 museums in Zimbabwe.
Okay, so
Yes.
in other words, you're suggesting that what is there at the Mutare Museum right now still advances
Exactly.
colonial interest.
So at the Mutare Museum, perhaps let me tell the Mutare Museum. The Mutare Museum has got 6 galleries, right?
Okay.
There is the Boti B Gallery. The Boti B Gallery is named after Boti B, Captain E.F. Boti B. He was the first curator at Mutare Museum, and he was able to amass quite a big chunk of firearms, European firearms, what they call antiquities, right? European-made firearms. And then this Boti B Gallery is full of rifles, it's full of guns, and it's full of ammunition that was used during World War One and World War Two, and perhaps getting back even to wars that were fought in Europe before the World War One, right? The internal wars in Europe. So this guy called Boti B was a curator. He collected from his personal collections these firearms. So they're displayed in this gallery, and the gallery is named after him. And then there's a section in the gallery which typically has got a very small section on the history of the liberation struggle in Zimbabwe, where you see guerrilla fighters being depicted in a gallery, right, holding rifles and supposedly portraying them as guerrillas, as it is not liberation war fighters. Guerrillas were trying to destabilize the current government. So there's a derogatory way in which the guerrillas are presented in the gallery. You know, it's not really presentable. So the liberation story of Zimbabwe in that gallery is not really. It's appended to this collection of firearms that we have in the Boti B gallery, which is also problematic. Instead of thinking of how we can represent and tell the story of the liberation struggle comprehensively in this gallery, we're still celebrating Captain E.F. Boti B, who collected a lot of firearms and did this exhibition for himself. Right? So if we talk about decoloniality, we're speaking about how after 42 years or 43 years of independence, how can we think about reconfiguring this Boti B gallery to tell the story of liberation struggle comprehensively, not just appending it to a curator, a white curator was able to collect and amass a lot of firearms during his tenure at Mutare Museum. So you understand what I'm saying, right? So this is where you start thinking about decolonizing the museum space. Right? And there's another gallery called the Bait Gallery. Fortunately, this gallery, it got some funding from the Bait Trust some 4 or 5 years ago, and we were able to give it new meaning. Right? We reconfigured it and we tried to. That's one part of the decolonial project. We went out to the community and asked them about the different kinds of Shona traditional activities that they are still undertaking, that they would want to be presented in the museum. So in the past, the gallery had quite a number of ethnographic objects that were just displayed like randomly with no meaning, drums, a Shona kitchen, the history of traditional chieftainships in Manicaland, traditional hunting methodologies that was depicted there in the gallery. But they didn't have a story to tell. They just randomly and haphazardly put in the gallery. So we got a grant to research about, right, these objects in the gallery by going into the community and asking them how they would want these objects to be presented. Right? So we did it. We went there and then we collected quite a number of rich ethnographic accounts on the uses of the objects in their day-to-day activities. And then we documented through video, filming, photography, and so forth. And then we went back to the gallery, rebranded it, and gave it a voice that is coming from the community. So right now when you go to Mutare Museum, there are some TV screens there in the museum where you can, about 5 or 6 in the gallery, you can actually interactively click and see the different kind of traditional activities that are being undertaken in Eastern Zimbabwe, which are connected to the objects that you find in this museum. So that was an essential part of what we did in trying to decolonize the museum space as an activity, collaborative production of museum exhibition, or what we call in academia co-curatorship. When you're co-curating, you're curating using voices from communities, right? Communities have to determine how they want their story to be told, not what you want as a curator. So it's called co-curatorship. Sometimes you can call it indigenous curatorship, right? Because communities have got a way in which they can also curate objects in the museum and let them have that voice and equally participate in the curatorship process. So that's a brief of it. And then we also, so that's one chapter that we wrote. We spoke about this new exhibition at the Mutare Museum and how we used co-curatorship in reorganizing exhibitions in the Bait Gallery. And when it was opened in 2017, 16, thereabout, it was quite popular. You know, people came in numbers and They loved the interactivity with the exhibition, and they're now really connecting with the stories, because once someone goes to an interactive video display, then they see these traditional dances and games and so forth that they know from their communities. Then they'll make sense of the objects and connect this story. Unlike a case when you just have an object in a diorama or in a glass case with no contextual background whatsoever, it's just being imprisoned there with no life. But these objects have to be given life because they've got life. That's the biography that we're talking about. They've got life. And that life means they have to be used in their day-to-day activities. So we tried to just invoke that category of the biography and how that biography can be represented through documenting and video filming activities that are in tandem with their use in day-to-day communities. So that's part of the project, and that's one chapter that is in the book, the collaborative production of exhibitions at Mtare Museum, looking at the reorganization of the Bay Gallery, which was done in 2015. Okay, and then we also wrote about another interesting exhibition that we did, the diamond mining exhibition, the Chiadzwa story. I think most of you are aware of the story of Chiadzwa, the discovery of diamonds in Chiadzwa, and what happened in Chiadzwa in 2016, and how Chiadzwa was invaded by then illegal miners, Makorogoza, they say called them, Magweja, right? So what we did, we thought that this story is very topical, and how can we represent it at a museum? How can the museum get involved in the story of Chiadzwa and the subsequent relocation of villagers to Ada Transao? So we went out to Chiadzwa. Soon after the relocation of the first batch of villagers in 2016, so in 2013, that's when we went there and we started gathering information on what really the community wanted to do. Like what were they expecting to get from the government in terms of compensation, right? Because they were being relocated. They were going to lose their graves, their heritage, their ancestral landscapes, right? And being put at a new.
Yes.
Yeah, they were leaving those things all behind. So as a museum, what could we do, or what could we have done to make sure that the story of the villagers is represented? So we did a research, like a collaborative research, and asked them about their challenges and what they expect to get from the government, and some of their bone of contentions in terms of the benefits of what they were supposed to get from the diamond mining itself. And we historicized the diamond discovery, who discovered the diamonds, and the geological formation of the Chiadzwa, kimberlite, pipes, and all these things. And we came up with an exhibition that addressed, right, the concerns of the villagers, right? Most of them, they're unwilling to be relocated to Ada Transao. Why? Because they are afraid of losing their cultural heritage. They didn't want to lose their graves, right? They've been living in that area for almost 70 years. So the government was supposed to come up with an initiative of compensating the villagers. So the exhibition in some ways acted as a social advocacy space. Right? So we documented their stories, their struggles, their challenges, and then we came up with a very nice exhibition, right? Very, very nice, looking at their displacement from Chiadzwa, their relocation to Ada Transao, and the promulgation of formal diamond mining by the different companies that were given concessions by the government. We wrote about Mbada Diamonds, Anjin, Kusena Diamonds, and the other companies that were there that were mining diamonds, and how they were failing to compensate or to reimburse, right, the proceeds to the beneficial communities. So communities were always at loggerheads with these companies on why they were losing so much from their heritage, their resources. They were the ones who discovered the diamonds, but they're not getting anything. So the story was told in the exhibition, like, comprehensively. And fortunately enough, we were able to get, by then, the governor of the province came to officiate the exhibition. It was Chris Mshowe, I think. He came to the exhibition, and then he was the one who was the official guest of honor. And from that exhibition, he was more like moved by the narratives and how we displayed them. And soon after that, there was talk about community ownership trust, compensation, right? Villages were supposed to be compensated, graves were supposed to be relocated, but they were supposed to be given money for exhumation and reburials for the graves. And then some were able to benefit from the initiative. And we think this was a spin-off benefit of this exhibition. So decolonization now in these aspects speaks to how museums can be used as advocacy centers, right? How can museum effect social change? Do you understand? So essentially this chapter talks about social activism in museums, right? How museums can be used not only as object collection centers, but as places where challenges can be articulated to, and people can come and talk about very difficult issues, topical, and then proffer solutions in the end. So decoloniality also advocates for a space for dialogue, right? Using the museum as a space where people can talk about challenges, issues, right, and how they can proffer solutions. So the diamond mining exhibition in this vein is one aspect or one vehicle of decolonizing the museum through social activism or through advocacy work, which indeed the Mutare Museum was able to front and make sure that people somehow got benefits from the diamond resources.
Some of the challenges that you faced during these
so that's a very good question. So as I said from the beginning, decoloniality is a process, right? It's an ongoing process. I think there's no right or wrong formula for decolonizing. But for me, effectively, you don't decolonize without involving those who were previously marginalized from the resource, right? Or from the object. So when you decolonize, you're thinking about how you can share knowledge production, right? In different aspects, right? And in a museum, how do we share knowledge in terms of exhibitions, right? In terms of educational programs, in terms of excavations, in terms of any other activity that you do at a museum, right? So how do you make sure that those people, when previously not recognized, have a voice in these activities? So at times, I think the major challenge with decolonization and its application within an empirical perspective is this idea of source communities. The word community is a very, very problematic concept, right? How do you really arrive at a definition of a community? Who's the community, right? And mind you, there's been a lot of changes, right? The community is not even homogeneous. There are many communities within a community, and communities have got different interests altogether, right? So if you're talking about a community that is claiming to have objects in a museum, are we really sure that this is the community that has a historical association with the object, or they're just claiming because of geographical proximity, right? So when you decolonize and talk about communities, what is the community, right? And how do you identify a community? Since the term community is very, very fluid, right? It's very, very fluid, and it's not even easy to pinpoint what really a community is. So there is a problem there when we talk about communities and how to involve them or how to collaborate with them in a decolonial mindset. Because at times we are not even having the real, what I call indigenous or autochthonous communities, the original communities. They might not be there anymore. And so we're now talking about what we call museum communities, right? So museum communities do not necessarily need to have a genealogical association with the object. They might just be there because they are living close to the museum and they know the objects that are being preserved or presented in the museum. They have a voice around the objects. So museum communities is more like a loosely used term, which doesn't really try to pinpoint really who is the original community member. It's just a community of interest, right? If you have an interest in a museum object living in Mutare, then you're a community, right? We can listen to you and allow you to say something about the object because you've been living in that area for quite a long time. So the challenge is, apart from just trying to define my community, there's also this idea of, each time when we think about decolonization and decolonizing and collaborating with communities, I think at the end of the day, the power geography still remains very much in favor of the curator. In as much as we think about democratizing the space of exhibitions and working with communities, but the curator still retains quite a significant amount of power, right, in determining how the exhibition is going to be presented. Of course, there will be voices from the community, but the curator still holds quite a big amount of power. Imagine, let me give you this example. Like, you're working with communities, right? Some of them, they don't even know how to converse and communicate effectively in English, right? And you want this exhibition to be in English. So when you interpret your labels or when you do the storyline, perhaps you've done it in Shona when you got the data from the community and stuff and work with them. But at the end of the day, the creator can twist and turn around some of the stuff to suit his or her own agenda, right? Because the creator would be the one who's going to make sure that the collaborations that have been done with the communities are presented in a very readable or understandable format. So in that vein, the curator still holds quite an excessive chunk of power. So decolonization doesn't mean that there's an equal democracy in everything. No, there's still one person who holds a good amount of power, and in most cases, we have curators who still have the power to determine how the exhibition or how the project is supposed to proceed. So that's one big challenge around decoloniality: the unequal distribution of power. In as much as we think it's equal, there's still one person who's going to be so much in control of the project. And decoloniality, again, reinvent back the idea of coloniality where people were just mash out to agree and to accept things that they were not part of. But however, the conversation around decoloniality is a better conversation because at least it gives chance and opportunity for communities to be there when exhibitions are made or when projects around the museums are formulated.
When is this publication going to be made?
So the book itself is going to be released for pre-orders online on Tuesday, the 12th of April, to be available. And then once it's available, I think I can gladly share with you and your audience the link on which we can purchase. If you are going to purchase it now before June, there's a 30% discount. It's going for 34 pounds, I think 34, 38 pounds. If you purchase now, you get a 30% discount from the publisher. It's published by Taylor and Francis, Routledge, UK. So 12th of April, the book will be hitting the shelves, online orders and physical copies as well. You can order and then the book can be posted to you. So the 12th of April is the date when the book is going to be released.
We're looking forward to reading the whole.
Yeah, I think for information again, I think that is going to be one of the first comprehensive texts on museum practices in Zimbabwe. There is a book by an edited book by Dr Njabulo, and who else is there? There's a book on museums in Zimbabwe, making the museum practice in Zimbabwe. But it's okay. It's quite good, very good, with a collection of chapters. I have an article in that book as well, published in 2015. So this one now is coming out as one of the first or second comprehensive texts that speaks to the museum practice in Zimbabwe in a single or co-authored volume, right, on a specific museum. We only talk about Mutare Museum. It's not like so I rather think it's going to be so beneficial to museum students or archaeology students at universities in Zimbabwe, Great Zimbabwe, Midland State, Bindura, University of Zimbabwe, and at NAST, where people are undertaking courses around build environment, build heritage, and so forth. So I think it's going to be a fundamental text for a long time to come, since it's one of the first texts that really speaks about the museum practice in Zimbabwe and how practically we can attempt to decolonize it and give it new meaning within the discourses of involving communities.
Okay, Jock.
Yeah, surely we can speak again on my other numerous projects that I'm working on. So anytime, just let me know when you think you want me to have as a guest again on your program, and I'll gladly avail myself for quite a number of issues on heritage and because we have another project that we're doing when I was at the museum, which is very fascinating. In Bohera, it's called the Matendera Festival. It's a very collaborative project again, which involves the community around the management of an archaeological site called Matendera in Boera. And it's been running for 10 years, I think. It's an interesting project which perhaps needs to be spoken to and advertised so that people know that heritage is very important. People are preserving their heritage in different activities, and the museum itself is also aiding this presentation and preservation by involving communities. So I would like to speak about that later on, perhaps in other programs. But thank you so much for having me, and hopefully we have another conversation in the future. But welcome, and I look forward to the recording and the post of this podcast.
That was Dr. Njabulo Chipangura giving us an insight into his latest publication, as well as going even further to state the challenges that are there in decolonizing the museum space in Zimbabwe. Hopefully we get to talk to him sometime soon. Remember to follow Zim Culture Podcast on all social media platforms.